Welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your bank of knowledge of investments, economics, and geopolitics. Go to goldnewsletter.com for our publications and archives to increase your wealth monetarily and educationally.
This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host here. Thank you for your ongoing listenership and support. The show keeps growing, and I've really been enjoying the latest episodes. Today we're going to discuss perhaps my favorite topic, the one I've been exploring for so long, Latin America, the economics of Latin America, and we have a finely tuned or well-selected guest here, the managing editor of LatAmInvestor.com. That's LatAm-investor.com, and his name is James McKeigue. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Fergus, for that impressive introduction. It's not often I get described as finely tuned, and it's even rarer that people pronounce my surname correctly. So, yep, it is James McKeigue from LatAm Investor, and thanks for having me on your show.
Right, and James, he said he's a financial journalist. He's based in London, but he has, in his career, he's been both between the UK or the British Isles and back here. I'm based in Guatemala City, as many of you know, and he's just written a very nifty overview of what is going on here. But before we get to that, why don't you tell us a little bit of your background, because it's just a funny story the way many of us end up here. How did you get to Latin America?
Good question. I ask myself the same thing sometimes. After university, I worked for ITV, which is a TV channel here in the UK. And then after about a year of that, I was pretty bored. My day job was just moving adverts around. So I traveled to Latin America. And while I was there to make ends meet, I got hired by this internet betting ring. And basically my job, it was shady. I never actually met the person who was employing me. I got paid through the internet, which back then was quite cutting edge. We're talking about 2005, 2006. But basically I'd get an email every week telling me to go to a football game. And then once I got to the football game, I had to speak on my mobile phone and just constantly update them. Not like commentating on a TV on a match, but constantly giving them certain information. So who's got possession, if the ball's gone out of throw. And I think they use this information. Either they were trying to fix online betting, which was in its early stages back then, or they were trying to stop other people fixing it. But basically they wanted real-time information, because me giving that information through the phone was maybe a couple of split seconds quicker than they would get it through the television. So I had that job, and because I was doing that and going to every single football match, or lots of football matches, I ended up getting a gig writing for a now defunct English language Buenos Aires paper called The Argentines. And I was their football correspondent, and I was writing about football, and it was very exciting at the time. There was lots of hooligans, what they call barra bravas, causing all sorts of problems in Argentine football, so I was writing about that.
Oh, wow.
And that was really the kickstart of everything. After that, I traveled Latin America, I went back to the UK, and ended up getting a job for Forbes. So obviously that's a business investment magazine. And since then, I've just been writing about investment, either in London or in Latin America, but always writing about investment opportunities in Latin America for British investors.
Wow, mate, that's such a great story. Yeah, so Argentina, an odd or peculiar country, and I spent a year there as well, and I used to scratch my head a lot at how things worked there. But okay, so did you live elsewhere in Latin America, or you've just been traveling through?
No, so I mean, it depends how you define lived. So
right.
One of my gigs was working for a company that basically wrote business reports for specialized trade magazines. So a magazine like Engineering and Mining Journal or Oil and Gas Investor would hire our company to go and produce a special report on a particular sector in a particular country. So we did oil and gas in Brazil when they made all those big discoveries in 2008. We did mining in Mexico. So I would go to a country for maybe 3 or 4 months. So I don't know if you define that as lived, but I'd spend 3 or 4 months in the country interviewing all of the key decision makers in various sectors, and then going back to headquarters and writing up the report. So thanks for that job, I basically lived and worked for 3 or 4 month periods in every country in the region apart from Venezuela. Obviously now is not a great time to be writing investment reports in Venezuela, but everywhere else, Brazil, Mexico, Bolivia, you name it, I've been there and written reports.
That's just great, man. Incredible. Yeah, so a wealth of knowledge here. And the article which caught my attention is titled International Investors Vie for Latin American Gold and Silver. And the basic claim is that Latin America has all these resources if you can get them, right? So there's a big proviso. There's all this potential, but something or many things in between you and those resources. So why don't you clarify to people what is the big allure? You use this term, I think, underdeveloped in this piece, or underexplored, for example. How do you make the claim that there is perhaps potential here in Latin America that has been underutilized?
So I think it's very interesting. So if you're looking specifically precious metals, obviously there's about 500 years of history since Spain discovered Latin America of international investors, if we want to call their conquistadors investors, maybe they were pirates and robbers, but of international investors going to Latin America, trying to extract its resources and bring it back. So that's been going on for 500 years. But if you go more specifically, it's basically Latin America is this big, huge, and depending on the sector you're talking about, if you're talking about agriculture, you can call it a breadbasket. If you're talking about oil and energy, then you've got Venezuela. And it's got massive, if you're talking about gold and silver, then we can call it El Dorado. Whatever particular natural resource or commodity you're talking about, what you've basically got is a situation where Latin America has 10% of the world's population, roughly 10% of the world's population, slightly under. And in all of those areas that we've just mentioned, it's got a far higher proportion of natural resources. So just to give you some figures, it's got about 20% of the world's oil and gas reserves. That's according to the BP Annual Statistical Review of Energy. It's got 20% of oil and gas reserves and 10% of the population. It's got roughly 20% of the world's gold production. It's got the biggest copper reserves in the world. The most, if you're looking at farming, the most arable land available, so that is potential farming land that is not being used at the moment. The most of that extra potential land across the world is in Latin America. So any of these natural resources, commodity sectors that you want to look at, Latin America is overweight in potential because it's got such huge resources and it's got a relatively small population. So this is, just to clarify, this theme applies to lots of natural resources. Same with lithium. About 54% of the world's lithium reserves can be found in the lithium triangle, which is Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And obviously lithium is one of the key metals of the future because it's going to power everything from electric vehicles to batteries for solar power. So there's so many natural resources you can look at. You're going to find them abundantly in Latin America, and because it's got a smaller share of the world's population, it makes it a natural exporter. So in this particular article that I'm pleased that you found interesting, we were focusing on gold and silver, but that's part of the general theme across many commodities.
That's true, and it seems like almost anywhere you look, you find these examples. So one country that has caught my attention, and I work with a guy from there, is Paraguay, and I'm just looking up here that it's the world's second largest producer of stevia and the 8th largest producer of beef, and this is just a small, people outside of Latin America hardly have heard of Paraguay. So I just agree with you wholeheartedly that there are incredible resources here. So...
And then interesting, sorry, just to jump in there with Paraguay, I congratulate your use of Google for finding that information out while I was speaking to you. But no, just another point about...
I did look that up while we were chatting. That is true, yes.
I could tell. There were such random statistics. I thought that's got to be Google. No, but just for example, Paraguay, a good example, they've obviously get a huge share of energy from hydroelectric dams, and they are a electricity exporter. So Paraguay is a good example, and you could pick almost any Latin American country, more so in South America. In Central America, there's less natural resources, or they're not quite being exploited. But you could pick any South American country, or Mexico and North America, and you could find examples like the ones that you've just found on Google.
Right, and I used DuckDuckGo for anyone who likes to use alternative search engines. That's the one I go with. So,
good to know.
Yeah, and then I'm going to quote you here. Despite the attraction, miners continue to face many challenges as they mine precious metals in Latin America, as well as the risk whipped up by political instability, institutional corruption, and organized crime. Gold miners have to grapple with growing environmental opposition, complex regulation on community relations and widespread legal mining, unquote. And one of the nice examples, which you didn't explain necessarily in the article, but I've known about, is Tahoe Resources here in Guatemala. But why don't we unpack that claim from you? You make the point about political instability, but then you give some optimism. You think that's turning the corner.
Yeah, so again, just if we're going to give a historical context to this, and I'm sorry to keep on going back to the conquistadors, but I think it's important that we give historical context, because basically this is nothing new. We're not reporting news, we're just analysing what's going on. And I would say, so let's say during the Spanish Empire, it was relatively simple, because obviously with the authority of the Spanish king, once you had your concession to mine, you could do whatever you want. You know, you had all the technical problems that come with mining, the problems of raising capital, the problems of the price of the particular metal that you were mining, but you did not have any community relation problems or environmental problems. You could do what you want. Then after independence, okay, so you've got to deal with the local elites in that particular country. And again, that was relatively simple, because if you're dealing with a rich landowner and he needs a foreign expertise and foreign capital, which back then, just as now, is what the international mining companies bring, if he needs that foreign expertise and capital to develop that resource, then you didn't have any problems with community relations or with environment or with complex local regulation. That's clearly changing now. And you'd have to say, on balance, that's probably a good thing. So it's a good thing that local communities in Latin America have been empowered, that Latin American countries are now much more democratic. And that's a good thing, because we've got all sorts of examples of extractive companies. So I'm thinking now of Chevron in Ecuador that didn't have to worry much about community relations or regulations and committed horrible acts of environmental vandalism.
Whoa.
So,
well, yeah, I want to just pause you there for a second. I don't necessarily agree with that, but there is a documentary that I think it's called Black Gold about what happened with Chevron. I think at the time it was Texaco. I can't remember the details of.
No, you're right. It was Texaco. Yeah, and Chevron then bought Texaco and assumed. And I think there's an ongoing legal case about that. But I think that the basic point is this. One is so with the environmental thing, it's clear that if you look back 50 years ago, there were definitely acts of environmental vandalism of companies who came there and didn't care. They were just throwing waste materials that weren't being filtered or processed back into the surrounding area. And the other one, which is linked to communities, is that lots of the areas where precious metals were being mined or oil were being extracted, they weren't seeing the benefits. So it's like, hang on, we've got oil well that's producing tens of millions of dollars per year, but if you look at the town around the oil mill, not always, but in many cases, it was underdeveloped. So and this is just a personal view, tracing it back from the conquistadors, back to the early days of independence, back to the days when you had the British oil companies that kick-started the Mexican oil boom, the British and American companies that kick-started the Venezuelan oil boom. If you look at it through that historical progression, you're clearly seeing that in a more democratic Latin America, the communities, the environmental groups have more power now to kick back against the project. So in the broad scheme of things, that can only be a good thing. But in specific terms, in terms of specific projects, it gets troublesome. And why does it get troublesome? Because Latin America, large parts of Latin America, have only been democracies since the 1980s. So they're not mature democracies. They haven't yet established the regulatory framework or the constitutional checks and balances that allow you to fairly weigh up the needs of the community and the needs of the environment on one hand, and the needs of the country to attract international investment. And I think that's what you've seen. For example, you mentioned the case of Tahoe in Guatemala. I think that's a perfect example of that. Because they have, if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's like the world's second largest deposit of silver, Escobal. It's an absolutely huge deposit of silver. It's immoral and it's wrong that a country as poor as Guatemala, a country that suffers from malnutrition where kids don't get to eat properly, is sitting on one of the world's largest supplies of silver. That silver should be being mined, and Guatemala as a country should be benefiting from that. And why has that not happened? Because in Guatemala, you haven't got the constitutional checks and balances. You haven't got the regulatory framework that has been able to balance the needs of the local community with the needs of the whole country to get the investment. So that's where we are at the moment. In the broad context, it's good that we got more democratic Latin America, but unfortunately, many of the countries haven't quite finely tuned their regulatory framework to balance the competing needs of international investors with local communities and environmental concerns.
Yeah, the story from Guatemala breaks my heart, actually, because I'm a little bit more familiar with it. And as you said, basically it's just been put to a complete halt. It's just been stopped. At the time, there were, when they were actually working on the mine, there were so many violent confrontations that I'm trying to remember the details now, but basically those working on the mine had to come in through helicopter to not deal with the roads or to avoid confrontations, and one got shot down. And so that kind of brought it to a head. But the problem is, like you said, it's a fact. Guatemala is poor, underdeveloped, it suffers from many problems. There's crime here. So it is unfortunate that has just been put to a complete halt rather than coming to some sort of amicable agreement. My own view is that unfortunately many of the organized criminals aren't really this leads to one of the other points in your article. They enjoy the black market environment. And so you note here widespread illegal mining. I'm not sure whether this is the most important aspect of your piece, but you note that in 80% of all gold production in Colombia is illegal, 77% in Ecuador, and 28% in Peru. I don't know how one finds these numbers, but do you want to comment on why that is still such a big activity, big proportion of the market?
I think it all boils down to the point that I was making earlier, that these countries still haven't found a way to balance, they still haven't found a way to mine these resources safely and responsibly in a way that benefits the whole country, which it should do. So, I mean, you've mentioned criminal groups. There's all sorts of political pressures. When you talk about illegal mining, it's a big business, and there's all sorts of vested interests that are represented there that are clearly going to be against their concessions, or they're clearly going to be against their mines being handed over to fully regulated legal miner. So I think this is basically part of the process that Latin American countries are going through, where they're trying to come up with the regulatory mechanisms that can allow for safe and fair investment.
Okay, so we are aware of political instability and maybe widespread criminality here. But, like all things, they do improve with time. I'm not saying that Cuba is getting better anytime soon, or Venezuela, but there is a rising tide. Just modern technology, more transparency are having a positive impact on the area. And you quote Mark Bristow, the new Barrick CEO. He says there are big elephants to be found in Latin America. Is this big elephants term widely used? I'm not familiar with it.
I've heard it more in the oil and gas industry, when they talk about elephant fields. But I would defer to Mark Bristow. I'm sure he knows more about mining than you or I. He had a great tenure with Randgold Resources. So no, I think it's very telling, and the reason why we quoted him in that article is that someone who's got a successful track record as he is zoning in on Latin America.
There's also another really interesting stat you quote here, that despite all these challenges which you've mentioned, and maybe some rising political opposition or hurdles, combined gold production in Peru, Brazil, and Chile has risen by 25% since 2001. So that's the conclusion I have too, that we can discuss all these challenges, these problems, but people are making it work. They're overcoming these challenges.
It's interesting there, if you look at the year 2001,
yes,
obviously that starts to coincide with rising commodity prices. And I think that's a big factor as well. I mean, this would be my cynical view, is that when you've got high commodity prices, there's enough money to share around. So when you've got high commodity prices, there's an incentive for the international investors to go in there and to deal with the bureaucracy and the regulatory uncertainty. There's enough money to be given to different community groups, and there's enough money to make it all work. I guess when you get lower prices and the pie is smaller, that gets a bit harder. But I would be positive. And like you say, as journalists, sometimes we focus on the negative, and certainly when you speak to people in the industry and you ask them their challenges, they focus on the negative. But broadly, I'd say it's positive. I mean, Peru, over the last 15, 20 years, has been a huge, huge success story in mining. Mexico has been a huge, huge success story in mining. Chile already was very, very successful. I mean, if you look at Peru and Mexico in particular, because Chile obviously was already successful from before that, but if you look at Peru and Mexico in the last 20 years, they've attracted tens of billions of dollars of international investment, lots of Canadian money, lots of British money, and they've managed to give their formal mining sectors huge boosts. And then if you look forward, so they're the people who've done it in the last 20 years, and if you look forward, there's a couple of other jurisdictions that are emerging, and the two I'm thinking of really are Ecuador and Argentina, that look like they're well placed to be very successful over the next 20 years. So there's definitely more positives than negatives.
I also see, this is maybe not in mining, but almost definitely not, that your website or your Twitter account has a special report on Costa Rica's economic transformation. So, I mean, I'm not sure whether that's hyperbole or not, but it seems like you have found some more optimistic points. And you make a note here, too, that foreign capital is needed to develop the region's riches. Yeah, whatever the barriers are, there is a need. There are resources going to waste and not being utilized. So that seems like the main lesson here, that there's still a great deal of action here to be had. Now, we've raced through the time here. Are there points in this article that particularly you wanted to, you want to highlight or make clear before we wrap up?
Do you know what? I would like to leave the article and just focus on, because I would like to focus on the success stories that we could expect to see over the next 10 to 20 years. I'd like to look at Ecuador and Argentina. So the interesting thing about both of these countries is that we don't know how much mineral resources they have, but it's probably an awful, awful lot. Because when you look at both of them, and obviously they're all along the Andes, and you look at their neighbors. So, for example, if you look at Argentina, it shares a stretch of the Andes with Chile. On the Chilean side, they have realized lots of very successful, large-scale, world-class mining projects. They've done very few on the Argentine side. Now, as the Argentine Minister for Mining said to me, it would be incredibly cruel of God if he had put all of the copper on the Chilean side and none on our side. So I think you can probably expect. So really the challenges there are the regulatory environment, and we've seen with the Macri government there's been a lot of positive advances where, I mean, obviously the Macri government is a business-friendly government, a market-friendly government, but it's basically a case of if you create the regulatory environment, it's not rocket science, if you could create conditions that are welcoming to investors and conducive to investment, then probably the geology is there. So it's just a case of attracting the investment. So that's in Argentina. In Ecuador, it's something similar. In terms of geology, it's different, but the same principle applies. If you look at Ecuador, Colombia, the neighbors to the north, and Peru, the neighbors to the south, have managed to build very successful mining industries. So it seems inconceivable that Ecuador's part of the Andes wouldn't also be rich in minerals and metals. And the interesting thing about Ecuador is that it doesn't have to be a so-called pro-business, market-friendly government. So with Argentina, that was the case with Macri.
Yes.
But with Ecuador, you actually saw some very interesting advances in mining in the last year of the Rafael Correa government. And basically what happened there is that Correa, early on in his presidency, had made a very, very tough mining law. Mining companies decided that it was too tough, so they didn't really get involved. And then realizing that, like all governments, it doesn't matter if you're right-wing or left-wing, you need international investment and you need money to be able to realize your programs. Realizing that he wasn't attracting sufficient investment, he rewrote the mining code. If I'm not mistaken, I think they did it in partnership with McKinsey. They came up with a really investor-friendly mining code. And now Ecuador is one of the most exciting, let's call it greenfield frontier mining destinations in the world. So I definitely think if we're talking about mining in Latin America, we can expect more good news than bad over the next 10 to 20 years.
That is great to hear. Yeah, so the website is LatAm-Investor.com. We've been speaking with James McKeigue, and I'm so pleased. You can also follow them on Twitter, other social media platforms, and the content is free. It's available, so you can go right there. Thanks for your time, James.
Excellent, Tiger. It's my pleasure. Nice to be on the show.